Thank you, Park. Just to kind of add to what Park said, when I started to learn about the challenges that fiber farmers in this region face, it was actually my engineering mind that kind of kicked into gear, what I think is my engineering mind that kicked into gear. I heard a problem that needed an answer, and I said, okay, how do we work on solving these issues? So you'll see as I go through this presentation that we're not there. Like, we're actually still at the question phase, but this is kind of a setup for the question phase and how we currently think we might approach that. And I'm very open to any thoughts, advice, feedback that you have. I feel like these kind of opportunities are really valuable for that, especially since we are very green. So thank you for coming, and yeah, I'm here to present working to find solutions in the upstate New York fiber-to-textile supply chain. So I thought I would start by telling you a little bit about myself. I am a graduate student here in the Materials Science and Engineering department, and I work in Nicole Benedict's group. Her group works with DFT and group theory to help elucidate characteristics of perovskites or layered perovskites. But, as you know by now, that's actually not why I'm here to talk today. I'm here to tell you about Local Fiber, and that's the organization that myself and Victoria Hantu had started. Victoria has stepped away. She is a manager, actually at the Gimme Coffee right over there, and as a manager, you have to spend a lot of time putting out fires, so time was a constraint. But that's besides the point. So Local Fiber is an organization that was established just late last year in 2017, and its goal is to engage the small, local small flock fiber farming community. It's a lot to say, in identifying and addressing their supply chain challenges. So how does Local Fiber intend to do it? There's a bunch of services that we offer to the farmers. The services kind of grouped into 3 categories, which you can see here: engaging the fiber community, improving market opportunities, and connecting farmers to makers. I'm not going to get into too much detail what they're made up of, but as you can see, there's a lot of little components. Shameless plug, I'm always looking for volunteers to help with any one of these goals. So one thing you could be asking is why? Like, what's the need for an organization such as Local Fiber? To start answering that question, and that's really kind of what the whole presentation that I have for you today is about. And to start answering that question, I was just going to paint you a picture of the New York State and Finger Lakes fiber community. And I should say that the numbers I got here are from the USDA-NASS website, and that's from a 2012 survey, so they're slightly out of date. And USDA-NASS covers sheep, goats, and I think alpacas. There's many more fiber-producing animals, even in this region. There's Asuna, llama, camel, rabbits. So in other words, the numbers you see here, and the numbers pretty much throughout the entire presentation, don't represent everything, but they give you a good idea of the trend. So there are over 400 fiber-producing farms in New York State. Out of those farms, just under half of them are located here in the Finger Lakes region. And what's interesting about that is that, so if you look at the trends throughout the country, I think in 1997, 85% of all fiber-producing farms were actually small flock. Small flock is less than, well, it's about 100 head or less, so counts in the hundreds, even in the tens. So the New York State, that's really concentrated in the east and the northeast. There's only 2 large block farms that I know of in the northeast. There's Kyle Farms outside of Rochester, and there's Chatham Farm, which is actually moving here in Tompkins County. Large flock is over 1,000 head. We're talking about a couple thousand or more. So in other words, over about 200 small flock farms in this region alone. This data here is actually, it's an example, again, it's a trend, The group the survey was taken from, to give you these numbers, was a small portion. It was like 57 farmers out of New York State. That is just to give you an idea. So 63% reported annual farm income of less than $10,000 and 2% greater than $75,000. And that was actually Dr. Helen Trejo had presented that in her master's thesis just a couple years ago. Something I want to kind of highlight here is, again, this small flock interest. And the reason why I want to highlight that is when you talk about small flock farming, you're now no longer really dealing with, no longer dealing with the commodity market, or oftentimes these farmers choose not to deal with the commodity market for certain reasons. And the commodity market, the supply chain that is currently in place was really designed for that commodity market. So I was going to quickly describe to you the supply chain. And so the images here all represent components of the supply chain. It starts off with the farmer and their animal. I included a woman here for a specific reason, because actually the majority of small flock fiber farming farmers are women in New York State. I don't have a number off the top of my head, but I know that's something actually Dr. Helen Trejo had presented as well in her research. So it starts off with the farmer and their animal. A shearer comes in and removes the fleece from the animal. That fleece then has to be sorted, graded, and classed. That is a process where they decide on the quality of the fiber, dependent on its micron size, and judge the general quality, how well the fiber held up in production. At this point, you can see I have kind of this white line here. You can't really see it. There's actually a little white arrow, probably a bad choice of color. That white line is shown to separate. I put it there to kind of separate a choice a farmer can make at this point. The farmer can choose to contribute to a wool pool and therefore go to the commodity market, or they can choose to navigate the rest of the supply chain on their own and contribute, and the end product is the niche market, goes to the niche market. So a lot of the small flock fiber farmers, as I said earlier, will decide, or often decide, to go the route of navigating the supply chain and going towards the niche market. And the reason for that decision is actually they get more return. The niche market has a higher return. I think recently, I was looking at the numbers yesterday, and I think it's 55 cents per pound in the commodity market, and you're not even making your money back on the shearing at that point. So, okay. So shearing, grading, classing, and classing and grading is also important because later on it helps decide what that wool will be used for. So after that, it goes off to shipping. Shipping, I was actually surprised about what a large role shipping plays, meaning that it actually incurs many times during the process, during the supply chain process, and it's actually a very costly portion, especially if you're a cottage industry. After shipping, you go to scouring. Scouring is a chemical process, a chemical cleaning of the fleece that removes the vegetable matter. It literally just kind of melts the vegetable matter away from the fleece, which increases the return on the processing, the actual end product processing. A lot of small flock fiber farmers would love to scour. There's actually only 3 scouring facilities in the country, one of which is on the East Coast. It just doesn't, money-wise, make sense to send them all out to scour. There's other ways to wash. So then it goes off to processing, where it literally turns that fiber into yarn that is made up of many more components. I decided to cut it off at just saying processing. And then goes back to the farmer for marketing and distribution. So, what was I going to say? So yeah, kind of just to point out again that the key here is that just like any supply chain, there's many different components that these small flock fiber farmers have to navigate on their own. And if you're a more vertically integrated company, that tends to be the case if you're a purchaser off the commodities market, it's much easier to navigate this portion of the supply chain. But for the farmers, if any one of these things break down, it can really hurt their bottom line. And they're barely making do as it is. You know, for instance, just last week I got an email from one of the farmers I work with because their shearer broke his foot. Okay, so find another shearer. But there's scheduling that happens months, sometimes a year ahead of time for these shearers. And also too, shearing, for instance, often happens, shearing is done around the time of lambing. So timing of things is very important in order for the farmers to kind of meet that next stage in the process. And it can cause a lot of difficulties if things don't.
Does shearing, dumb question,
Yeah.
does shearing have to be done by hand? Can you run them through some kind of
No.
gizmo?
I think from my knowledge, all the shearing I've known is by hand. There is machinery to make it easier, but it's still somebody doing it. There is some chemical shearing processes that I don't know enough about to speak of. But no, it's done by hand, but there are some mechanical things to help in some situations.
Right, you can't tell the sheep like, walk very straight. Yeah. All right.
So this supply chain is really based off of a time when the United States wool industry was kind of at its heyday. Like I said, you can kind of tell from what I was just saying that it's really built for a commodities market, industrial commodities market. So I was gonna, like, the bulk of the talk is really kind of laying the groundwork for why it is that case, and it's a bunch of timelines. And I hope you find this as interesting as I do, because I just get so, this is so fascinating to me. Hence my doing it on my free time. So with each of these timeline slides, I included an image of a snapshot of the United States at that point in time. And as we move along throughout the timeline, I'd like you to just kind of keep that snapshot in mind for each one of these slides, because it's interesting as we move along to imagine how that might affect the wool industry. So now I also do want to say that I focus on the wool industry because it is a commodities market. There's a lot of information out there on it versus some of the other fibers. So this snapshot is 1800. And to start off at the beginning, basically in 1800s, before the 1800s, unless you were an urban person, you had sheep. You had sheep, you had flax. The clothing that you wore on your back came from your own flock, your own crops. So before the 1800s, it was really everybody had it for themselves, unless, again, you were in the urban markets, and there was a small import market from England to supply the urban centers. 1802, the first merino were introduced, and this I'm just kind of pointing out because merino play a large part in the history of the wool industry. And they were introduced at this time to the estates. They were estate flocks, so Livingston in the Hudson Valley, Colonel Humphreys in Connecticut. And what we know now as merino, we think about it and it's very soft against the skin, North Face, smart wool qualities. But what was important to merino historically, I actually found really interesting in learning this because it wasn't that against the skin soft that was so valued. In fact, when you looked at price per pound, merino got the same price per pound as many of the long wools or the coarser wools that were used for rugs or upholstery. It was the density of the fleece. So there was more pound per head on the merino, so a farmer could make more money off of the merino. So by 1807, I think there was, I'm not going to pretend I know history, these are just facts I learned. There was some sort of European restriction on American goods. So in retaliation, the United States Congress at that time placed this American Embargo Act, which restricted any trading ports and trading in foreign ports. So that decreased the imports to the urban market that was coming from England. So this is actually the beginning of the United States wool industry. By 1810, another little fact to store, because later on it comes into play, 20,000 merino were introduced to the States, the Peninsular Wars in Spain. Again, not going to pretend I know the history. Peninsular Wars in Spain, the king needed to offload his merino flock. So 20,000 sheep ended up actually in Vermont. And those sheep ended up spreading out throughout the entire United States. And this is important because now merino were available everywhere. So War of 1812, as you can imagine, wars help all industries. Wars help the wool industry. The War of 1812 increased demand on woolen goods. At this point, the industry was really a household industry. So you were a homemaker, a home producer, a cottage industry. 1820, start of the Industrial Revolution. 1828, the Abominations Tariff, which again, that one was put in place to help the industry in the northern United States. So between the start of the Industrial Revolution and the Abominations Tariff, by 1830, the wool industry was really kind of up and going. In fact, the machinery had been improved to such a point that they can now produce to a demand that was growing in the urban centers. By 1838, it was woolen production and processing was considered the most profitable farm industry. And by 1837, double the output. In 7 years, double the output of woolen goods from 1830. An interesting fact is that half of the sheep in the country at this time were in Vermont, New York, and Pennsylvania. New York State in 1845 was the largest wool-producing state in the nation. So 1845, the concept of wool pools was invented or was introduced.
What is that?
A wool pool is currently they're in place so that you as a farmer can then go and drop off your wool and forget about it. That's what goes to the commodities market, and you get like 55 cents per head. And I believe it was a similar but not the same kind of idea back then. So I love this slide. So 1845 to 1860, you can see the country's growing. The industry moves west. And it moves west for really money. The cost per head of sheep in the east, it took over $1 to raise the sheep. In the west, it was under $1. There was land was much more affordable. Hay was naturally growing, it didn't have to be cultivated, and you no longer need fencing. So for those reasons, the industry really started to move west to the point that in 1860, there was pretty much an abandonment of the wool industry in the east. This changed in the Civil War years. A lot of people who had previously abandoned the wool industry decided, oh great, let's make some money while we can. Picked it up again, but it was, went down soon thereafter. An important thing today even is that in the early 1860s, merino and other fine wool sheep were introduced to Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. And I'm hesitant to say they're one. I think China is #1 in wool production right now, but they are definitely within the top 5 of wool production. So 1866, so Civil War ends, and 1866, actually I'm not going to pretend I know when that ends, Civil War. 1866, there was a talk about placing high tariffs on wool imports. And right before the tariff got placed, there, in fear, a number of shipments of wool came into the country. So between the Civil War ending and that reaction to the fear of the tariffs, there was an immediate sharp decline in 1870. So if I was to kind of go back to this timeline again and talk about the mutton or the meat prices, you'd see this fine dance happening between the wool. As the wool increases or decreases, the mutton kind of goes the other direction. At this point, what happens is currently the focus in the sheep industry is really on meat production. And this is where the change occurs. The wool industry goes down, the meat production goes up, and that becomes the focus of the American sheep industry from there on out. And just, an additional kind of knife is that 1930s synthetic fiber was introduced, and that just really killed the wool market. So, you know, a lot more has happened since then, but you get the idea. The peak was in 1845. There was a huge industrial complex that got built around that peak, and then it just started to die off. Just to kind of add to the timeline, sorry, wrong way, because I just think this is interesting. Again, the states, the little snapshots of the country in time. 1800, 7 million head sheep. At the peak, 56 million head sheep. And remember, 56 million head sheep in New York State had about a quarter of that. 2003, look at the difference in the size of the country, but 7 million head sheep. So just large decrease. And to bring it home, I wanted, I'm not sure how well you can see this. I wanted to kind of paint a picture of the New York State sheep population. This is from the USDA-NASS website. They didn't have statewide data prior to 1920. So this starts in 1920, but from literature, it's a really broad range, I recognize that. But again, it's just to paint a picture. Around 1840, somewhere between 4.5 to 14 million sheep. But by 1920, just over 500,000. And then today, 92,000 sheep are in New York State. So, so now, if we go back, right, so again, like I said, kind of follow the industry curve, follow how that could have affected the design of the supply chain, and then think back again to New York State, and what we currently have in place are small flock fiber farmers with a variety of breeds. It starts to kind of pose an interesting question. And we add to that this concept of the LOHAS consumer market. LOHAS stands for Lifestyle, Health, and Sustainability. It was a tagline that really kind of came into effect, I think probably early 2000s, mid-2000s. This data is from 2010. They currently, for 2010, they made up 20% of the United States market.
Wow.
And they're, you know, how do you describe them? I feel like, look at the pictures. It's a good description.
I'm that.
Right?
Yeah.
I'm them. You know, it's like they're typically well educated. They typically have expendable money. They are concerned with things such as social justice and environmental sustainability. They are huge.
Here they all are.
Yeah. I mean,
There we are at the farmer's
yeah,
market.
right?
The only difference is I mostly talk about going to yoga. It still counts.
I feel like we can all look at this and see a mirror. But yeah, so they're a huge market today. And to kind of relate them to the fiber movement, you know, so the slow food movement in the 1980s really was kind of the birth of local food. There's actually a slow fashion movement that's kind of happening, and I can actually pinpoint, if you have any questions, I can point you on to a few places and organizations that are really pushing for that. But with that slow fashion movement, there's an expected push towards local fiber, and we are actually seeing that on a few locations. So the question kind of ends up with, you know, how can the small flock fiber farmers of the Northeast meet this market need, right, with this very fragmented supply chain? And that's what Local Fiber is working on answering, and that's what other organizations that are answering similar questions as well. Like Fibershed, for instance, which is based out of California with over 50 affiliates internationally, nationally and internationally. Their focus is definitely more on the fashion end. The woman who founded Fibershed, her initial concept was to build a wardrobe 150 miles from her house. And in finding that she couldn't, she started to work towards building regional fiber-to-textile supply chains. Right now, their focus is more towards environmental stewardship and proper grazing techniques on land in order to make any sort of textile farming more environmentally sustainable. I really admire the Carolina Textile District. So Appalachia has this amazing textile history. They really depended on it in the 70s, 80s, and even the 90s. The textile industry just left and outsourced, and a lot of people were left kind of high and dry. With that, the Carolina Textile District really started to band together, and what they do is tie together these makers throughout the community to be able to produce on a market level. It's really a cool organization. Campaign for Wool and American Wool, I put them up there more as an example as pushing the market for wool. They really are trying to encourage people to see wool from a different perspective than they have over the past many years since synthetic fibers have been introduced. But they're also working on sustainable businesses for the wool industry as well. So really local fiber has only just begun. So we're actually in the process of asking these questions, and we recently got awarded a SARE grant, a SARE partnership grant, together with CCE Tompkins County, and this grant is working to design a set of guidelines using project management and product management protocols, and hopes that some sort of formula can be formed that can be then passed along to other communities who want to do similar things. We're currently working on a proposal with some Cornell faculty to build a systems dynamics model of small flock local fiber supply chains. It's such a bold thing to say. And then finally, we're coordinating with other organizations to address local fiber supply chain challenges, such as the Hudson Textile Project, which is just over the Hudson Valley, Fibershed, and ASI. That one's kind of tentative. We do meet on a quarterly basis with the farmers. Right now I meet with a little over 34 farmers and growing to work in our community on addressing those challenges. Some farmers have brought up ideas such as, let's get a scouring mill, a scouring facility in this area. What about processing? Some farmers have even said things such as, what if we coordinated shipping so we can decrease shipping costs if we coordinated group of us shipping at the same time, or shared shipping costs?
They could Uber it.
They can Uber it.
They call it a big Uber truck, and they all can sign on. Okay.
I'll present that to them and see what they say. So really, the point is and has been that it's an interesting challenge. In fact, one of the faculty had said, you're trying to decommodify something. And it really is, I feel like I use that word so much today, commodity, but it's taking something that has been seen so long as a commodity product, or however you say that, and trying to make it a viable industry for these farmers and for the rural economic regions that they're from. So, that's really all I have to say.
Can I throw a question?
Yeah.
If you're a wool farmer, does your supply of wool fluctuate a lot every year?
Many of the farmers that I've talked with, they know how many, it's very well planned. They know how many sheep they have. They know when they're going to be shearing. That shearing timeline, they know almost down to the inches of wool, or if it's goat mohair, that that animal will produce. If it fluctuates, it's a thought out. It's not just arbitrary. It's thought out and planned. Yeah. But it actually does put a lot of the volume is part of the challenge in navigating, because you can imagine if you're a large producer, and for instance, going back to the shearing example I said in the first place, the farmer who had his shearer break his foot, and now he has to find another shearer, but if you're a large flock, you don't have one shearer coming in. You have a team of 5, 6, 10 shearers coming in for an entire week. So it's not the same kind of, it's still a difficulty that appears, but it's not the same weight of difficulty. So the volume does, I guess my point is the volume does play a role in the challenges. So, I thought it.
Let's thank Dana, and then we'll open it for questions. Okay, I got it.
Yeah, if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Could you just go back to your first slide? It had a huge discrepancy in price difference between the 2% and the other percentage of people. What was the,
Yeah.
what is the 2% garnering over everyone else that they're getting such high?
That
concern?
she didn't report on in her thesis. My guess, she was in contact with Kyle's farm, so that's the large producer during her research. And there are a few farmers that I know of who have it figured out. A lot of the farmers, if you're producing fiber, that's not the only thing you're producing. So this says reported farm income. And she didn't specify it was just from fiber. That's something key, because a lot of these farmers, they also raise crops, they raise meat, beef meat, they raise chickens and eggs, so
Honestly, it could be anything.
there could be anything.
Okay.
It is,
Yeah, because I was gonna say that 2%'s got it figured out.
yeah,
Their sheep are 10 times bigger.
Must be it, right?
Yeah, they got the big ones. Yeah.
They figured out how to use the mechanized shearer.
Yeah.
They walk very straight. Along those lines, because, okay, as of my big preamble alluded to, yeah, it seems like there are all kind of benefits, you know, to this decommodification. Yeah. You know, how do you unwind the economic machine that has like come and done its thing? But then the catch is, like, how that machine got there in the first place is there some way to do this where the wool's not going to be expensive? You know?
right? That's a good question.
Yeah, like, you know, if there is, then it's like,
Yeah,
because it, you know, you get to that 20%, what's the acronym? LOHAS?
LOHAS.
Yeah, so it becomes like a niche for high-end,
Yeah,
you know, rich people come, they
yeah,
wanna like commune with the sheep,
yeah,
you know, and give
Pick
it some
their
pets.
sheep.
yeah,
It's like that, the Portlandia episode where they go to eat brunch and they end up at the chicken farm, like, talking to the chickens, yeah, you know. And so, you know, the revolution gets co-opted into like just supplying things for rich people,
that's
instead
LOHAS.
of like, you know, we're somehow gonna unwind this
Yeah,
and make like local farmers make money, and then people get like local product,
Yeah.
and it's like, you know, it works,
Yeah.
you know, economically.
Yeah.
That's the magic trick
Yeah.
or something, because, you know, the machine got there because they can make it cheaper.
yeah. And that's actually talking with some of the farmers I work with, that's a concern that the farmers have too. I shouldn't make it sound like it's across the board. A number of the farmers I've talked with, that is one of their concerns. Traditionally, like, you know, I came at this as a knitter or spinner, and you know, in more recent times, like if we're going back to the 1800s, that was a necessity for people to do that for their home goods. Now, more recent years, it is actually the privileged class are able to do that sort of thing. So it's interesting to come at it from that perspective, knowing that I ran into this problem because I had something expendable in order to contribute to the community, but it is a concern of the farmers.
And I'm not,
Yeah.
you know, like totally denigrating it. People are like farmers, you know, the most of them, if that's total farm income and they're less than $10,000, and that's 60% of like, and I know some farmers are
It's lifestyle choice.
yes, well, yeah, there's no way to make money.
Yeah.
The small farm thing. And so, you know, if you said to them, hey, I have a way for you to make money,
Yeah.
you know, we'll sell fiber to the yoga people, and the farmer would say, okay, whatever, like, I don't care, like, sell it to whomever, you know. So I'm not like denigrating that,
Yeah.
you know, just, I wondered if it's, you know, the best would be if it could somehow be,
Yeah.
you work all this out, and then it's like, oh, and it undercuts
Mhm.
the sheep from wherever we get it now, or the wool from wherever we get it now.
I don't know if you have any thoughts on how to make that
Yeah,
possible.
right.
I know.
I've got an idea.
Yeah.
All right,
So
Robots.
can we just
Oh.
say, yeah, no robots involved.
okay.
So we have local fiber and then we have corporate fiber, just, as two broad categories.
Sure.
So the system dynamics model, I don't know if anyone is familiar with like Danella Meadows and Jay Forrester, that kind of started the whole system dynamics idea. They have this thing called the beer game, and anyone can play, and it seems like it should be obvious, but it actually, you have this incredible volatility, and the volatility is created from delays in the supply chain, and those delays can be anything like, transportation or off seasons or whatever it is, but delays create this incredible volatility. So how do you deal with that? Well, the big corporations stockpile, and then they can price gouge, and countries can price gouge other countries by flooding the market, so the locals can't succeed in that market because the price is so low. And then once the locals are out of the equation, the corporate price can go higher than it ever was originally, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no,
But-
listening for the
Yeah. And that's how Walmart works. They come in and they drive out all the local competition, and they raise the prices higher
Yeah.
than they were originally.
Some
So-
people just have to go to class.
Thank you.
It's not that I'm asking questions.
And John comes from system science department,
Oh,
so he's
perfect.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
versed in all this like system.
Well, that's the dynamics model.
Yeah, I know, actually, that's one of the things, you just reminded me, Park, on your statement, that's one of the things we're excited about if this proposal goes through, is to be able to kind of break it down. And from my understanding, systems dynamics models, you can kind of compress time and tweak the systems and see long-term and short-term effects. So that's what we're hoping, that if we're able to get this proposal, that will help kind of answer your question of like, how can we avoid, because that's not sustainable, right? So if you're only a part of this, like, we want it to be a sustainable model. We just don't want to create something that works now for the farmers. We want it to last for a long time.
Well, it's a huge,
Right.
huge topic. If you have some kind of systems dynamics model
Yeah.
that can, undercut the global corporate, the corporate model of wool. If you can do that with
Yeah.
wool, then you could do that with many other things. And this is like a big topic. You see
Yeah.
communities like Detroit, and Detroit is this like incredible situation where it used to be this, vibrant like capital of the world, incredible city, and now it's basically abandoned. And it kind of like
Right.
inside the city are people who are trying to figure out like, well, we're not really part of the national and global economic system anymore. What can we do kind of locally
Yeah.
to kind of have businesses locally and generate money, generate income kind of among ourselves and locally? So people are trying to think of different business models that are local, that are, outside of this corporate realm. And if you could like crack the code somehow
Yeah.
and say like, well, here's how you do it, you don't have any delays somehow, or, you figure it out, and then, it would work for
Yeah.
upstate New York wool, it would work for, other types of
Yeah.
exchanges and things in other types of areas,
That's
I mean, it
definitely-
could be incredible implications.
It's definitely not unique to just the wool industry or the fiber industry. It should be. You had a question.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, if that proposal ends up getting passed, or whatever term you want to use, is that to benefit the current farmers, or is that to add additional farmers? Or a combination of both? And then on top of that, is there an intention that would continue on for a 5 to 10 year plan, or is that just per year and we revisit it every year?
The proposal is definitely aimed for current, which would imply future, and it's one of 4 stages in a 4-stage process. So it would be extended. The idea is the results of this stage of the research could then be extended to another stage down the road. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
It does, I can read that, yeah, absolutely, okay.
Sarah?
Oh, well, Park just made me think about this a little bit, but I come to this as I'm an American historian, right? And it seems to me that part of what you're doing is rebuilding the Grange system from the from the early 19th century, but where the grange system for farmers was set up to build the commodities market, right, and to enable farmers to hedge against the price fluctuations which were endemic in the 19th century, and then get their goods out to the broader American community. Like, what you need to do is also hedge against the broader economic system, but bring the market inside, basically bring the market back inside New York State, rather than looking outside the state to bring it back, back into the community, rather than what the grange system, was set up to send everything out of the community. And I'm sure that's where these wool pools started. I mean, I don't know the history of wool per se, but I'm sure that's what that is. It's just an outgrowth of the grange system.
Absolutely.
And so, so you want to reverse engineer granges, and then it seems to me that these proposals for things like a scouring, some kind of local scouring, some kind of whatever the production model is, if it's a textile mill or what have you, then that has to also be local too, in order to undercut these external producers, that everything has to revert back in.
And actually, it's interesting that you mentioned kind of bring it back into New York State, because one of the things that is unique about what we have here, we have New York City. Like, New York City is such, which also makes it kind of hard to you have to be careful, because we have New York City.
Does that count?
Great market.
If you sell it to New York City?
Well, the industry is there. The design houses are there.
That's why New York's the Empire State Park.
Yeah. I mean, but that's what kind of what throws it into okay, it's great because the market's there, so we can really play with it, but that's not a market you see in other localities. So how does that then kind of affect results?
Yeah, a kind of a basic question that has been kind of touched already, but are these farms, especially the smaller ones, sustainable as they are now? Are they at risk? So is there a component of preserving also a certain fabric, social fabric in this case, or is just a way to improve or rebuild, or as you were saying, change a little bit the parameters of the equation?
So I think it's both, right? So you might want to re-ask the question. I might not have.
Well, my reaction was
correct
they're
answer.
definitely at risk. Aren't all these farms at risk?
Yes and
Not
no.
really, no.
There's the farmers who are trying to decide if they're going to keep the farm going because they're barely, if they're making money, it's slim. There's the other farms. It's also a lifestyle choice, and a lot of people who do take on these types of animals, they're typically a two income, and one income takes care of the household, sort of say. So I'm not sure if that answers. So there is a risk on one end. On the other end, it's a lifestyle choice for a bunch of the farmers. Extending what you're saying, there is potential. Even though this is a lifestyle choice for many of the farmers, there's potential that it can improve the rural economy by kind of getting past this first stage of understanding the system's dynamics and moving on to be able to build infrastructure. If you're building infrastructure in a community, you're increasing wealth in that community. So I think I went off on tangent, but I'm not sure if I answered your question.
I believe there is a value in a sense, occupying the country. So when these realities disappear or are at risk, maybe I would say there is an issue. That something needs
That's a good.
to be done.
Yeah.
Is there a way to help farmers with the health of their sheep? Because I went to another presentation where some engineers had invented a monitor to help horses, for example, detect dehydration. So are they generally a healthy animal, or is there any sort of monitoring system engineers can help them with?
Yeah, I don't know about that, if there's anything missing. I do know that there's a specific parasite that is a big concern in the community. I don't have it off the top of my head, but if you want me, I can get it to you.
Because I imagine they have trouble affording veterinary care.
Yeah, and actually, when I showed the supply chain, one of the things I didn't say, which I meant to say, the supply chain I showed is all the direct components. There's so many, like veterinary care, that are kind of off to the side and aren't direct. But no, I don't know that. That's actually a good.
Is there is the consumer part of that four-step proposal? For instance, like, if you have small flock farming like that, you're gonna need consumers in order to sustain an income, whatever the income may be. Does that also, I would assume that that would also help the farmer if there was a consumer protected or involved in that proposal as well, so that you can maybe foresee the future, if you will, of the potential for income. Is that part of the process?
It's actually, so in designing the model, it's part of the process. There's case studies, there's surveys, there's interviews. Part of the proposal is I would spend time at fiber festivals and meeting with designers and talking to the folks that are the end use consumers to build an idea of how they tie in.
Yeah, because I was thinking that if they had like the consumer had
Stable market, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, to stabilize the market, exactly. There you have it. So if they had the ability to work together and that proposal affected both entities, it would certainly keep, I would assume, the consumer from looking elsewhere for cost effectiveness and for the fiber that they're utilizing it for whatever product they're making from it. Because I assume this is a niche market in some sense, probably more than some.
You could have like a CSA, people, buy in, and then they go to, every week there's a drop off, and they can pick up like a hat or socks or like a wool sweater, depending on what the farmer produces that week. Yeah, good years, everyone is like, really stylized.
But I was gonna say it's a CSA, but when you go there, you scour the wool. Okay, here's the wool. Can you people get to work? Yeah, help us out here. Yeah. All right, lots of ideas.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, let's thank Dana. All right. Get a bumper sticker, support local fiber. Add it to the 50 bumper stickers you already have on.